Affordable housing is in increasingly short supply in California. Studies indicate that the state will need 1 million more new homes by 2030 just to keep up with its population growth. What does this lack of affordable housing mean for the economy generally and for middle and low-wage workers in particular? And what are the possible solutions? We'll ask F. Noel Perry, the founder of Next 10, and Brian Ulor, a housing and land use expert with the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst Office. California's looming housing crisis, truth and consequences.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente, Thrive, from the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute. It's the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. We're joined by F. Noel Perry, a venture capitalist and philanthropist and founder of Next 10, which is a nonprofit focused on long-term answers to the state's most pressing problems. And one of those pressing problems is affordable housing. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
So Next 10 has something called the Compare 50 project. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to affordable housing?
Sure. Next 10 created the Compare 50 project because we wanted to create factual information that policymakers and also California residents could use to analyze how California is doing economically compared with the other 49 states. The inspiration for the creation of Compare 50, which has been a work in progress over the last 4 or 5 years, was Next 10 really looking at the conversation going on in California about whether or not California is business friendly or not. On the one hand, you had those who said we were one of the best economies in the country, high GDP, diverse economy. On the other hand, you had people who were saying California has high taxes and regulations. So Next 10 wanted to find a way so that we could create data that you could analyze the performance about.
Yeah, you're doing comparables, all right? You want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Exactly.
And I think we have a tendency sometimes to be a little insulated. We kind of think of ourselves, it's good to compare yourselves to others to see how you stack up.
Exactly.
You know, you've done on several reports on affordable housing. One was entitled California Employment by Income. What were your findings there and how do they relate to affordable housing?
Sure. So in June of 2014, California got back all the jobs that were lost during the recession. However, many of those jobs were in low-income industries. So the problem that we're facing here in California is that we have many low-income workers who can't afford the housing here. On the other hand, our report showed that there was an 11% increase for both middle wage and high wage jobs. So I think one of the takeaways here is that California is doing very, very well in terms of job creation post-recession. However, we have a housing problem.
And some of those low-wage jobs are in hospitality and retail and healthcare. Those are some of the areas?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So your report also, you did another report called California Migration. It ties into all of this. What were your findings there?
Sure. From 2007 to 2014, 625,000 people left California. And this is net. And, you know, if you look at those coming in and you net it with those leaving.
Okay.
The majority that were leaving did not have 4-year college degrees, and most of them had incomes that were under $30,000.
So the people that are leaving are low-income people.
Exactly. However, 50,000 net people came in that have college degrees that are also in the high-income sector making over $50,000 a year.
And what do you attribute that to?
Housing. We think there's an affordability challenge in California, with most of that affordability challenge focusing in the area of housing.
Okay, so the jobs are being created, they're being generated for those low-income workers, but they can't afford to stay, they can't afford to live there.
Absolutely, that is the challenge for California.
You know, so you issued another report called The Current State of the California Housing Market. So can you sum up some of the findings you had in that report?
Sure, that one's easy. California is the most expensive housing market in the U.S. There is an imbalance between supply and demand. The average homeowner pays roughly 25% of their income on housing. And if you look at rents in California, we're the third highest for rents, In other words, there are only 2 other states that are more expensive in terms of rentals.
I'm just wondering, 25% of your expenditures on housing, comparing nationally, is that, I assume that's high compared to the nation?
Absolutely. That is at the top.
Okay, and
at the top.
I'm sorry, so I interrupted you. You were talking about rents were the 3rd highest, I believe you said?
Right, rents were the 3rd highest. So essentially, California is near the bottom in terms of housing supply. Also, state average for a house is $459,000.
Great if you own one.
Yeah, great if you own one, but that's double in terms of the national average.
Right, and there is a distinction though between homes in coastal California and homes in inland California. They're much less expensive inland.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there is a crunch particularly on the coast. And the LAO did a report which was very, very interesting. They did a great job. One of the takeaways from that was that from, let's say, 1980 to 2010, California would have had to have created almost double the number of units that we didn't create.
And we're going to talk to the LAO in a moment. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Our next guest is Brian Ulor, an expert in housing and land use policy with the Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me.
So most people looking to buy a house in California realize there's a housing shortage. So last year the LAO, your office, issued a report entitled California's High Housing Costs, the Causes and Consequences. What were the findings of that report?
Well, our report had several findings. The first was, and as you said, one that's pretty obvious to everyone, and that is that housing in California is pretty expensive. In fact, it's more expensive than just about anywhere in the country, and in fact, there are only a handful of places in the entire world where housing is more expensive than on the California coast. And the reason, and this isn't a recent phenomenon. This has actually been, California's housing costs have been rising much faster than housing throughout the country for several decades now. If we look back to 1970, median home prices in California were only about 30% higher than the rest of the country, and now they sit at about 2.5 times the rest of the country. So the high housing costs currently are not just a recent phenomenon. They're one that's been developing over several decades. And the primary driver of those high housing costs is the fact that the state has a significant housing shortage, again, that's been building up due to undersupply of housing over several decades. And there's a lot of factors that have been driving this undersupply of housing. We see heightened community resistance among local residents to housing. We see that state environmental review policies, particularly CEQA, can constrain housing development, and also that state rules about local government revenues can provide perhaps perverse incentives for local governments.
That sounds like Prop 13. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I heard you say something. You said coastal. The housing prices are much higher, obviously, on the coast than inland. So is there a housing shortage in inland California?
So that was one of the key findings of our report also, is that we did find that California has a significant housing shortage overall, that looking back over the last 3 decades, if we wanted to have reversed the trend that we saw in terms of California getting much more expensive than the rest of the country, the state overall needed to build about twice as much housing as we saw. But the second finding was that the distribution of that housing actually needed to be quite a bit different from what we saw, and that is that much more of it needed to be in our coastal areas. And in fact, the inland probably built about as much as was demanded there. And in fact, to the extent that we've seen rising costs in some of the inland areas, in fact, we think a lot of that is sort of spillover demand from their neighboring coastal jurisdictions.
Sure. Some think that it's not about more housing, but rather expanding government programs to help low-income housing. And there are lots of different programs. There are programs at the federal level, the state level, the local level. Let's quickly kind of go through those. What are some of the federal programs to help people afford housing?
Sure. The 2 key federal programs are, first, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which essentially provides tax credits to developers of affordable housing for low-income households that helps to fund a portion of their development costs. The other key program are housing vouchers, which essentially help pay low-income households a portion of their rent that exceeds 30% of their income. So those are the 2 key federal programs.
So what about the state programs?
The state has a variety of roles in affordable housing. They administer the low-income housing tax credit program. They're the ones that are in charge of allocating that amongst developers who have to apply for the credit. It's competitive. The state also over the years, primarily through bond financing, has provided what's known as gap financing, and that is that in many cases developers, even with the federal low-income housing tax credits, still have a hard time making projects pencil out, and so additional funds are often provided through state programs, again, that are often bond financed to help make that work.
And then we've got local programs. What are they?
Locals, again, they play multiple roles. Local housing authorities administer the voucher programs, and locals also have a variety of initiatives. One is rent control.
Rent control's a big one.
Many local governments have inclusionary housing policies that essentially require a portion of all new developments to be set aside for low-income households.
You know, but it's interesting to note that most low-income Californians don't receive any assistance for housing. So you were mentioning in your report that the need for housing assistance really outstrips the resources. I'm just wondering by how much?
That's right. So California, according to the most recent data, has about 3.3 million low-income households, and that's defined by sort of conventional definitions. And only about a quarter of those receive some type of assistance through by living in housing constructed with low-income housing tax credits or by receiving a voucher. So that means essentially that over 1.5 million low-income households in California receive little or no assistance, and they spend more than half of their income every month on housing as a result.
So 3/4 of the poor don't have housing assistance, essentially.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you for that overview of government programs and how the poor find affordable housing. But up next, we're going to talk about state policies. Are they creating more or less affordable housing? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Brian Ulor, a housing and land use expert with the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office. One possible response to the lack of affordable housing is to expand current programs. Would that work, and how much would it cost? So what would it cost to expand existing assistance programs in a way that really would make a difference in terms of making housing more affordable?
Well, the answer depends a little bit on which programs you're talking about expanding, but in short, I think the answer is that it would be extremely expensive. And that drives primarily from what we were talking about just a minute ago, and that is the broad scope of the need that we have. Over 1.5 million households that are potentially in need of assistance, and that would mean that probably you'd need to spend in the low tens of billions of dollars a year, which would put, if California were to commit that kind of spending, that would put it in the range of the largest state general fund expenditures outside of education.
Yeah, just looking through the numbers, I don't want to be too wonkish on you here, but the numbers I got from your report are you need a public subsidy for coastal urban housing of $165,000 per unit. And there are 1.7 million people that would probably need this assistance, or households that would need this assistance. So we're talking of a total program of $250 billion. Now you would roll that out over annually, but even then you're talking $15 to $30 billion. That's a lot of money.
That's right, and I think, yeah, particularly in the context of the state budget, we're talking, you know, in the range of $100 to $120 billion.
Just to put it in context, I'm trying to, you correct me if I'm wrong, but prison costs, it's under $10 billion, I think, and so this would be 3 times that. So we're talking about a very, very large program. So what about, instead of building more affordable housing, just expanding the number of vouchers out there, provide more vouchers?
Right, so in California, the challenge is that fundamentally the issue of why housing is so expensive is that you have too many households competing for too few housing. And what vouchers do is they allow certain households to be more competitive, which doesn't sort of address this underlying issue. It potentially exacerbates this competition among households. And so what you see is that this can lead to vouchers being less effective. You can see that in competitive markets, there's some research showing that landlords will be less inclined to rent to people, to voucher recipients, because they don't want to deal with sort of the requirements that come along with that, and they'd rather just rent to someone who doesn't have those strings attached. We also see that there's some research showing that in tight markets, more vouchers can lead to rising rents, as that sort of feeds into the competition among households.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read in your report, you state that, quote, any approach that does not address the state's housing shortage faces a number of problems. And so you're pointing out that, for example, vouchers can actually increase the cost of rent. I think I read in your report that one study found that for each 10% increase in vouchers, it increased monthly rents on average about 2%. So it just seems like you're chasing your tail in some ways.
That's right. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we pointed out too with that study, it was looking at the effects of a relatively small increase in the vouchers compared to what we would be talking about to help all of the households in need in California. So it really would sort of be unprecedented in terms of what the effects might potentially be.
And what about rent control?
Right, I think rent control potentially has some of the same issues. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that rent control can help some low-income households stay in housing longer than they otherwise may have been able to. At the same time, though, the problem arises for low-income households who are trying to come into a market or have to move within a market, that rent control doesn't help, again, to alleviate that competition that they're having to have with other households. So you find if landlords aren't able to determine who to rent a house to based on pricing, then they have to do it based on other factors, based on credit or employment history or other factors that are probably still going to place less affluent households at a disadvantage.
The other argument I guess people could make is that with rent control, there's less of a return on the landowner's investment, so it'll attract less capital to housing, and it actually makes the situation worse. I suppose that's an argument against rent control. You mentioned, the whole point here is we need to build more housing, and you say there's a number of barriers that are preventing private development of more affordable housing. Can you discuss some of those?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost it starts with the fact that local residents in many of California's communities don't want housing, and so they've sort of melded their local land use and zoning policies to be less conducive to housing being built. They haven't zoned enough land for housing, they've zoned it at too few densities to allow for sufficient development, they've created many procedural and bureaucratic steps and required heavy exactions and development fees from developers that all of this has stood in the way of additional housing being built. Also, we see that state environmental policies, particularly CEQA, can sort of exacerbate this local dynamic by giving local opponents and other opponents of projects an additional avenue to sort of challenge and delay projects and potentially require their scope to be reduced. And finally, we also find that sort of state policies that dictate how revenues are allocated across local governments can also be detrimental to the housing situation. Primarily, we see that the way that sales taxes are allocated amongst cities can encourage them to be more favorable to citing retail development.
It's called the fiscalization of land use, right? You'd rather have a car dealership that's going to generate money than a housing development.
That's right, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for that discussion of government policies regarding affordable housing. Up next, what else is the state doing or not doing to help affordable housing? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. So California is suffering from a housing affordability crisis. That much has been established, but who are and what are the culprits? We're back with F. Noel Perry, founder of Next 10. Interestingly, you've suggested that the data indicates that California's high taxes on the wealthy are not creating an outmigration of high-wage earners. That would seem counterintuitive.
Sure. Well, Next 10 commissioned Beacon Economics to do 3 studies on employment, migration, and housing. And what we learned from those reports was that 625,000 people net left California. And the majority of those people worked in low-wage industries. However, we also saw people who are in high-wage industries coming into California. So if we look at the progressive tax system in California, we know that people making $30,000 or less are not the ones that are being charged high rates of taxes. So we know just intuitively by looking at that the people that are coming are able to pay that tax, are able to afford the housing, but the people that are leaving are not really paying a lot of taxes. They're not leaving because of taxes. They're leaving because of affordability challenges like housing.
And there's lots of reasons that are driving the affordability issue. One of the things you talk about are restrictions on developers. So what types of restrictions are you referring to when you're saying this is causing a problem in terms of new housing development?
Sure. Some of the restrictions that have been talked about in California for a number of years, I'll just list them and then maybe drill down on a few of them. Sure. Number 1 is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. Number 2 is NIMBYism, people not wanting new people in their neighborhood. A third one has to do with lack of land, which is certainly an issue.
And I would see more on the coast, probably, right?
Exactly. Another challenge has to do with the fact that if you look at California in the Compare 50 database, in terms of the number of permits that have been issued, it's been very, very low over the last few years. And so these are some of the challenges. And the last one that I might mention is Prop 13, which has to do with incentives for maybe a community not wanting to build any houses.
All right, so pick a few of them. Let's CEQA, for example.
Sure.
What's the issue with CEQA?
The issue with CEQA is that when there is a housing project that's going to be created in a neighborhood, and I have to mention that all housing is local, so the people that decide whether there's going to be a new housing project in a neighborhood are the local officials and the planning commissions. So a large building project has to go, not all of them, but some of them have to go through a secret review where you have to look at what the environmental impact is from parking, from air pollution, traffic, et cetera. So it's possible in the secret review for the people in the neighborhood to work very hard if they don't want housing to try and stop it.
What about Prop 13? How does that impact the availability of affordable housing?
Sure. So counties and cities in California are more incentivized to do shopping centers, malls, hotels because they get sales tax.
So typically referred to as the fiscalization of land use, right? You'd rather have a shopping mall on a piece of land because it generates revenue than a housing development.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'll mention that, again, referring to the LAO study, they came up with the fact that 2/3 of municipalities and counties have restrictive covenants preventing housing.
What about NIMBYism? Not in my backyard. What's the issue there? It's affordable housing. They think it's going to take down the property values?
Absolutely. Property values, traffic, parking, essentially concerned that the nature of the neighborhood that many of these people have lived in for many years is going to change if you have large housing projects.
So what are the solutions?
There's a number of solutions. This solution that I'm going to present is just an idea. You know that Next 10 is a nonprofit, and we don't advocate. What we do is create reports that focus on factual information. But one idea is for the governor and the legislature to get together and create a commission or a task force and have leading experts across the state travel around the state to learn more about what the housing challenge is and come up with recommendations. When you look at CEQA and you look at Prop 13, CEQA was looked at a few years ago. You probably recall that. It's very, very complicated. There are many good attributes to CEQA. CEQA should not just be changed overnight to create housing projects, but it's kind of like threading the needle to see whether there are certain parts of CEQA that can be retained that are the good parts that create a solid environment for why we all want to be here.
So focus on the intent and not the unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Okay. Well,
exactly.
I want to thank F. Noel Perry, founder of Next 10, for joining us, as well as Brian Ulor from the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or check out our e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.